Aquí les traigo un mensaje a todos los mexicanos. Permítanme presentarles a mis queridos hermanos. Algunos vienen unidos con toditos familiares.
Greetings, it's your host, Gabe Morales. By now, you probably realize that I often do general gang overviews or special interviews with certain people on certain subjects. Sometimes I do gang-focused episodes on certain individuals or incidents. And today I'm going to talk about one that happened back in 1977. This was an investigation. I will not reveal who wrote it, but it was a major gang task force member in California. And this deals with gangs in the California Youth Authority back in 1977, in particular, recruits for the Nuestra Familia. And there are some key individuals mentioned in it that you may recognize. Some of them went on to be major leaders in the Nuestra Familia organization. Some of them went on to be major leaders in the Bulldogs. And some of them dropped out, as many prison gang members do. And I'll run off the individuals I believe who were the most important, influential NF in this letter at the end, along with their CDC numbers and California Youth Authority numbers, if I have them. I'm going to read it verbatim in parts, and I'm going to omit other parts that I either think that are either not real important or that may jeopardize certain individual security. So this report was written basically covering from the end of 1976 to early 1977, and it was based on a letter that was sent out by Carlos Gonzalez to his brother Jesse Gonzalez, also known as Chewy from Fresno, who was an adult commitment to the California Department of Corrections. The letter itself was saying that an individual by the name of Jaime, known as Jimmy Yamamoto, was cleared from membership in the group. The letter brings up quite a few security issues at the Preston School, but also mentions other California Youth Authority institutions. It goes on to say that mail had been monitored via the Department of Corrections and California Youth Authority, specifically from Jesse Gonzalez, an adult commitment at the California Institution for Men at Chino, writing to his brother Carlos Gonzalez, who was housed in the California Youth Authority. It states that Jesse Gonzalez signed his letters with the initials NF, which stands for Nuestra Familia. It also states that there were letters that went out to the Fresno County Jail, also from Carlos Gonzalez, and that in particular, he wrote to Frank Manuel Villagrana, known as Sleepy, who was a major factor in the Fresno Nuestra Familia drama. Here again, the initials NF were used by both parties. It also stated that other California Youth Authority wards were writing to Sleepy Villagrana. And Antonio Villagrana, known as Sombra, who I believe was related to Sleepy. It stated that Sleepy had appointed Jimmy Gutierrez from Fresno, who was known as Kukui, and he was named as the California Youth Authority NF lieutenant at Preston. Later on, Jimmy was sent to the Bureau of Prisons, where I understand he functioned for many years as an NF member, but eventually dropped out. The letter also mentioned Manuel Alfaro, who had been paroled to Gilroy, which was an area ran at the time by Black Bob Vasquez and Ezequiel Conejo Lopez. It states that Manuel Alfaro was known as Fearless. The letter also mentions Adolf Kabubi Duarte from Fresno, who I mentioned in the Fresno Bulldog episode as being a significant player in why the Bulldogs split. It states that Kabubi from Fresno was housed at the Paso Robles Boys Institution of the California Youth Authority in 1967. It also states that Pete Gutierrez was being developed as a sponsor for Jimmy Gutierrez, who was Kukui, who I mentioned earlier. And as I mentioned in the Fresno Bulldog episode, I had a lot of Gutierrez's that I dealt with, in particular Angel Gutierrez at New Folsom Prison, who was considered a leader for the Bulldogs. And the whole family was involved in that Bulldog split. Pistol Pete Gutierrez, he was later killed by Skip. Another individual who is mentioned in this letter is Carlos Silva, who is known as Casper. It states that he was 16 years old on October 3rd, 1976, and that he paroled 4 days later. He then went on to be involved in multiple homicides under the direction of Sleepy Villagrana. In particular, it mentions the October 17th killing, shortly after he was released, of Antonio Okun, These were all part of a rash of Fresno killings on orders of the NF that, again, led in big part to individuals from Fresno splitting from the Nuestra Familia. It also states that Casper pled guilty to the killing of Dan Duran of Fresno on November 10th, which was a few weeks later after he killed Okun. Another individual that's mentioned in the letter is Tony Zadare, who was housed at the time at the Fresno County Jail and was arrested for a homicide in Fresno there. Tony Zadare later on became one of the major players in the Bulldog splitting from the Nuestra Familia. I explained part of that in the Bulldogs episode. He was on the Bulldog Council. Now, when some people say that the Bulldog didn't come out until 1986, excuse me, but they're wrong. The Bulldog started around 84 to 85 at San Quentin. That's where the Bulldog Council was. I had many of those individuals on the yard at Folsom, including Zadare. Now, the Bulldog thing might not have hit the California Youth Authority until 86, but it was in the adult system a couple years before that. And like I said, while Crackers did not start it, he gave it their blessing, and he has Bulldog tattoos on his front of his chest, as does his brother, Roy Spooky Vindiola, as I explained in the Bulldog episode. And so all these individuals were key in the Bulldog splitting. Now, I understand that on the streets, the Bulldog thing really didn't blow up until the late 1980s. And at New Folsom, the Bulldogs were in full swing. They had probably close to 50 members just on Sea Yard at New Folsom. So they were well organized by then. But again, it takes a little time for word to get down to youngsters from the big homies and then out to the streets. Another key individual who became a major leader later is Mikhail Castillo. And it states that numerous wards were writing to him when he was housed at the Salinas County Jail. Also mentioned in this report is Abraham Dean Castro, known as Güero from Salinas. He was the brother of Richard Din Castro, known as Casper, who was an NF captain at the time. And it also mentions Larry West, known as Lencho from Salinas. I believe I had his son at New Folsom. Don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty sure. I remember a kid coming in by the name of West, which is not a Hispanic name, but he definitely was hanging around with the Northern Structure. I'm pretty sure this is the dad. Also mentioned is Tex Hernandez, Terrible T, who was housed at the time as a juvenile at the Fur Lodge, and that he was also corresponding a lot with Mikhail Castillo from Salinas, better known as Salas, or the Salad Bowl. They could tell that when Tex wrote to NF members that they were made because he called them carnales. Also mentioned is Manuel Gabriel, known as Cricket, who later became an NF leader at DVI when they separated some of the main leaders, like Black Bob, to Old Folsom 4A. Other individuals mentioned Gregory Manos Gabriel, Cricket's brother. Cricket, Gabriel, and the Gabriel brothers were known to have traveled to Washington State, as well as Richard Din Castro at least once, that I personally know of. When I say personally, I mean I met him when I lived in Yakima, Washington, which is a stronghold to this very day for the Norteños, and has had NF activity way back in the 1970s. I beg to differ with some California gang investigators. Also mentioned is Frank Ruiz, known as Spider from Southside Stockton, and that he was corresponding with Tex Hernandez and identified Frank's brother, Eddie Macias Ruiz, also known as Poche from Southside Stockton. It's very interesting to me, but Poche was a major player in the Bulldog split also. Contrary to popular belief, not everybody who ran with the Bulldogs was from Fresno. Poche was one, and I also remember Spooky Ruiz, who also was not from Fresno. If I recall right, Spooky later became a part of the New Flowers. A lot of the guys that ran with the Bulldogs that were not from Fresno later became known as New Flowers. A lot of people don't know that. The letter also mentions Adolf Gutierrez, Muggsy, who had recently paroled to Stockton. I had Muggsy at New Folsom A5 Violence Control Unit back in the early 90s. Another individual who is named in this letter is Rodney Hollingsworth, known as Indio from San Jose. Now, if you listen to Sundown, and I believe he mentions it in his book, The Thief on the Cross, Indio was stabbed at DVI and killed by the weight pile for associating with Mexican Mafia members. And he also stopped having his girlfriend bring in dope. According to Sundown, Indio was chased all over the yard at DVI and was screaming. According to Sundown, he just had a boneyard visit and his honeymoon when the NF stabbed him. They chased him all over the yard and he was screaming. My understanding is that the murder went down by Eddie Boy Ortega and Bozo. The letter goes on to state that even though this particular report only covers from the end of November 1976 to early 1977, that the investigator had been watching this NF activity for over 2.5 years. And it was his opinion that the Fresno group was the largest NF group at Preston, and the Salinas group was the second strongest at Preston. He also notes that there was a presence of the Mexican mafia, but this report concentrated on the Nuestra Familia. The report mentions an individual, Raul Mario Perez, known as Shorty, who was from the Santa Cruz area, and that he states his uncle was Crackers Vindiola, and his other uncle was Bernard Indio Vindiola. And finally, this is probably a big surprise for a lot of people, but an individual is mentioned named Mosco Saldano, who tried to kill me at my 21st birthday party, along with Richie Ruiz. Now, Richie Ruiz is a documented Mexican mafia member, although Mundo says that he was in bad standing. Roberto Mosco Saldano was with the Nuestra Familia, but evidently he later on was in bad standing. But both of these guys were straight gangsters in Seattle in the late 70s, 1980s. They were major dealers and controlled a lot of the crime in the Mexican community. In fact, they tried to take over El Centro de la Raza in Seattle, which I was one of the early supporters of and was the youth supervisor for. So I think I know what I'm talking about there. Mikhail Castillo's number was B56499. Abraham Din Castro's YA number was 9087, and he later had a B number 89347. Richard Din Castro was B58346. Kabubi Duarte was B47068. Greg Manos Gabriel was B64539. Muggsy Gutierrez was D21289 when I had him at New Folsom. Jimmy Gutierrez had a BOP number of 5499097. Peter Gutierrez had a number of B75900 and a BOP number of 52167-097. Tex Hernandez was B93658. Pochi Macias, when I had him at New Folsom, was C2585. Carlos Silva later on had an adult number, a D number, 27646. Antonio Villagrana later had an E number of 97494. Bernard Vindiola was B76614. Crackers Vindiola was B31465. And Anthony Big Z Zatare was C78567. I hope you enjoyed this brief episode and learned a little something new about the California Youth Authority, the Nuestra Familia, and the Fresneros back in the late 1970s. This is Gabe Morales signing off for Gangsters, Cops, and Politicians.
Permítanme presentarles a mis queridos